All right, hello everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for our webinar, Cybersecurity of Tomorrow. My name is Maddie Regis. I am the Marketing Content Coordinator for NetGain Technologies. And with me today are two of our security experts. So I'm going to go ahead and let them introduce themselves. Braxton, let's start with you.
Hi everyone, my name is Braxton Moulton. I am a security analyst with NetGain Technologies. I work primarily with Scott Logan, the Director of Security, and I do numerous things for our clients and prospective clients, many of which are audits and assessments and vulnerability scanning and things of that sort. So I'm looking forward to speaking with you all about this topic.
Great,
Hey, and
thanks so
my
much,
name is
Braxton.
Scott Logan. I am the Director of Security for NetGain Technologies, and I have been in security directly for the last 12 years. I have been in IT for, well, we won't say how long I've been in IT, but it's been a while. Really look forward to talking with you all today about cybersecurity, and Maddie, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, guys. Really appreciate you joining and sharing your expertise today. So, all right, let's go ahead and get started with our content. So we're going to start off with a poll here, which is just a pretty simple one. I'm curious to know if everyone in the audience has cyber insurance or not. Braxton, what are you expecting in terms of a breakdown over kind of a yes or no answer to this question?
I'm actually expecting to see the majority no. From my experience, I see that either they have cyber insurance, but it's not a very, I'll say, beefy policy, or not at all, not something that they've considered. Some of our clients that have more stricter compliance standards, when I think of specifically banks, they might have this in general, but from what I see, it's not something that is typically looked at or seen for customers and organizations.
Interesting. All right, well, let's close our poll here
I hope to
and
be proven wrong.
see the results. And it looks like you were correct, because it looks like just a little bit over the edge of 50-50. 53% said no, 47 said yes. So almost an even split, but tending towards not. So that's interesting. And that will get us into our next point here, which is discussing some of the recent cyber attacks. I'm sure everyone in the audience has read the headlines, read the news recently about some of the cyber attacks that have affected really the entire United States and some of our important lines of supply. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Scott for that.
Yeah, hey, so cyber attacks of 2021. Colonial Pipeline, obviously an enormous attack. This is the largest fuel pipeline in the U.S. And they were attacked with a ransomware style of attack. It came from a Russian-linked crime group that was basically deemed responsible by the feds. And this particular attack not only crippled them as a deliverable, but it also put an enormous amount of impact to other vendors that tried to pick up the pace for their absence. And it was a great deal of strife in the US. It caused prices to start to rise. And it was a not a dedicated attack to them. In other words, it wasn't meant to go out there and destroy the pipeline. It was simply out there to try to influence them to have to pay a ransom. And so what happened? Colonial paid $4.4 million in ransom. But why did they pay? Why did the feds told them don't pay? Why did they pay $4.4 million for that ransom? They had a backup and they had a recoverable model, but they still paid. And they paid because they threatened us to expose their data. 100 gig of their data was stolen, and they threatened to leak it on the dark web, and they could not afford for that to happen. And so they paid to eliminate that from happening. That's just horrendous in the effort that you're just fueling these attackers to do more and more damage to our industries, to our corporations through that. But it was a necessity on their parts to not have that information compromised. So how do these hackers break in? How did they get into that? Braxton, I know you probably know, but do you think that they broke in through their firewall? No.
No, it's something
No.
much more simple than that. It was a compromised password that was already leaked out into the dark web. And this is, if you don't have any sort of observations behind your information for your company that's out there on the dark web, take a look at a resource that provides that service and give it a try. You'll be blown away. And you'll have a few sleepless nights, probably, but you'll be surprised at how much of your information that you don't want to be out there is actually already out there and is being sold to the highest bidder.
And it wasn't an account that existed within their domain. It wasn't even that. It was a compromised password for somebody that used to work there that was for something else. Maybe it was social media, maybe it was their bank account. I don't know what the leak was, but that information was out there. It was utilized to actually penetrate through a virtual private network account that was sharing the same password. And so once that information was out there, they were able to process into the network, and they were able to move laterally through that network through that remote access. Just amazing how simplistic that level of attack was and how costly it was, not only to the US, but to Colonial Pipeline. JBS, USA Holdings. This was also a ransomware style attack. The FBI had deemed it be a Russian link group attack. This group is called REvil. And REvil is probably one of the most prolific and profitable criminal groups in the world. I think investigators also said that another Russian group called DarkSide was involved, but REvil was the primary influence for the payload, the ransomware delivery. And this group actually uses what they call a ransomware as a service solution, RAAS, ransomware as a service enterprise, and people can hire them to execute their attacks. What do you know about RAS?
Well, we call that, ransomware as a service. That's kind of tongue in cheek, and we try to have as much fun with that as we can, even though this is a very extremely serious topic. But you said the key word there that in what you mentioned was profitable. Ransomware makes money. It's a business, and if your organization, if your company didn't have data that hackers could make profit on, if it didn't make sense for them to exfiltrate that data and sell it to the highest bidder, if it didn't make sense to encrypt it so that you can no longer access it, and now you can't produce, they wouldn't be doing it in the first place. So now you hear a lot of talk about technologies going into the cloud, technology is going, whatever, fill in the blank here as a service. Well, now the baddies are doing it too. And you're going to see more and more of this. These high profile success stories are only going to feed into the flame.
Agreed. And how profitable was this? $11 million was paid for the ransom, simply because, once again, data exploitation and not getting that information out there. Just think of it like Kentucky Fried Chicken getting ransomware, and they don't want to lose their secret recipe. That's the type of protection that businesses sometimes are missing. They've got recoverable models, but they're not able to protect data exfiltration, and that's certainly what happened here. $11 million has now channeled and fueled those things. Now, I know the feds, I know some of you are thinking, hey, the feds got some of that money back. I know for Pipeline they did. I don't know if that's happened for JBS or not, but it's certainly something serious. And what to remember about ransomware and how this impacted these two businesses, as an example, is it no longer just goes in there and grabs your data and holds it hostage for your access. It exploits it. It cripples your enterprise and the ability to be protective. It puts redundancy in place so that it can happen again. And so even if you get it cleaned off, if you're not getting it completely rebuilt and cleaned out, then it can re-happen and re-encrypt you all over again. These things are very complex solutions now on how ransomware is deployed through. So it certainly is affecting.
They're so complex, Scott, that these hacker groups have support desks, so that if you pay the ransom, they give you a decrypt key and they give you a phone number to call, and they have people working a service desk to help you unencrypt your own data. And number one, that's possible because of how much money it makes, but number two, also how successful it is. And going back to Colonial, they paid the ransom, so that, you know, the threat of their info being leaked was no longer a problem. And your data being leaked is a common threat with ransoms. You will always get that threat. So that's a risk that you'll have to weigh if you're ever in this situation. We hope you aren't, but if you ever are, that's a risk you have to weigh. But they got the decryption key, and the method that the hackers gave them to decrypt their info was so slow, they ended up having to use their own recovery model anyway. So they lost more than just the $4 million that they ended up paying for that.
Absolutely, absolutely.
All right, well, that's some really interesting information. I had no idea about the service desks for hackers. It's pretty crazy. Okay, so now we've kind of discussed, those recent attacks that we've seen in the headlines, and we're going to start to move into more of our experience and what you can do about these possible threats. But before we get into that, I want to do one more poll, which is just asking, do you have a cybersecurity framework in place? And Scott, I'd love to get your thoughts on kind of what your experience is in the field in terms of this question.
For most businesses that are compliant driven, they're probably driven towards a framework. It's unfortunate that a lot of businesses just do not have the expertise inside their organization to be able to do that. They depend on third parties to help align them with the framework. There's several different frameworks that are out there. NIST is probably one of the most common, and the National Institute of Standards and Technologies develop frameworks specifically for verticals, and most businesses should be aligning to that. But not a lot of businesses have a framework in mind, but most compliance companies or businesses depend on one.
Interesting. Okay. Well, let's see here. We've got interesting spread. It seems like a good chunk of people do have some sort of framework that they're working off of, but some people are not sure. So we'll kind of go through some things that can maybe help you start to structure that framework. And as always, you can reach out to us after the fact and get Braxton and Scott's expertise for your particular business.
By aligning yourself to a framework, it helps you actually understand what your risk levels are, because you have based what you're doing in security controls against a recommended list of security controls in the framework. So that alignment helps you understand exactly where your risk levels are.
And that helps give you a path moving forward as well. So you're able to give yourself a baseline on what you have in place, what you don't, and where you need to get to.
Absolutely. All right. Well, kind of piggybacking off of that, let's go into the analysis of an attack. So this is going to be based off of things that both Braxton and Scott have actually seen in the field, the most common ways that hackers are getting in, moving around, and what you can do about it. So let's get started.
So we talked about how with Colonial, they were infiltrated due to a compromised password that was already out there in the wild. But what are some of the other leading factors that also can help hackers infiltrate your business and your organization? Well, number one is going to be the absence of managed and monitored perimeters. Specifically talking about having your firewalls that don't have a next-gen solution like intrusion detection systems, intrusion prevention systems, that's IDS, IDPS, IPS, you might have heard those acronyms before, but you need to have something that is observing in real time the types of attacks that are trying to come into your organization, analyzing that network traffic and what it's trying to do and who it's trying to talk to. Maybe you have something from the inside that's trying to get out, and you need something that's also performing that analysis as well. There are other resources out there that will have not only that solution within the device itself, but a security operations center, a SOC team that's also doing kind of the reaction, further analysis, and response for that. So that kind of solves a couple of problems for you. And having that not in your environment is like driving an 18-wheeler and not having side mirrors on. You don't know your blind spots. You can't see what's there. And on top of that, your hackers are going to leverage poor external patching. And having those vulnerabilities for your external devices, not keeping them up to date, you don't know. There are so many high profile vulnerabilities that are published weekly. You can go to numerous exploit databases and government sites that will show you all this. These are published multiple times a week. Hackers are going to be looking for that. They're going to hope that you're not patching externally. And the more that you are neglecting your patching on the perimeter, the less skilled the hackers need to be to run those exploits and get inside.
That's absolutely correct. And we're talking about north and south traffic, right? We're talking about internal to your network, external out your network, and where those are. And when we're talking about the ports of entry into your network, those ports are something that have to be addressed as far as them being open to the outside. Either the port needs to be either dedicated to a source, or it needs to be restrictive in what it can gain access to on the inside. Certain ports of influence are automatically searched for. There are scripts out there that are looking for 3389. That's your RDP channels, right? Your remote desktop interface. And if that 3389 is open on the outside, there are scripts out there that once they find it, they start executing the method of brute force. Once the brute force is completed, they're able to get into the network. Then it calls back out to the attacker and say, hey, I'm in, let's go. Let's get this thing rolled out. And so having an understanding about what's opening on your outside, on your perimeter, is so important. If it doesn't need to be open, it should be closed. Those doors do not need to stay open. If it is required, then maybe it needs to be reduced to a certain source so that it's not open to any speaking firewall language. We don't want it to be open to just anyone that wants to try to filtrate that port. And then the most important element of any security platform is your end user. And your end user is your weakest link. And we have to make sure that we practice strong social awareness programs with them. A lot of the attacks that happen right now happen through email channels because of a mistake made by an end user. Phishing attempts are super successful. And since the pandemic, phishing attempts jumped up 250% because of the remote workforce. So why did it jump up? Simply because they moved to a remote workforce. One, the user's mindset of not being in the office, their awareness diminishes. They start kicking their feet up a little bit more. They're at home. They're not as business sensitive to what's going on, and they make mistakes through those phishing campaigns. And that's why there was such an increase in social awareness. And plus, they started keying on certain things that were interesting. COVID-19 reports, or COVID-19 maps, or COVID-19 information was a very common phishing attempt because it drew a lot of attention. People wanted to know about that information, and so they fell victim to those types of attacks. So a lack of a good social awareness program is a high profile for getting your business penetrated.
That's exactly right, Scott. I don't care how many locks you have on your door. If you're sitting on one side and I'm sitting on the other and I want to get through, you've got the keys to those locks. So if I can convince you to unlock the door, that's less work for me. If I can get you to let me in, I don't have to do the hard work.
Totally agree.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's it's one of the simplest ways, probably a little bit less expensive, is to train your end users. That's something that you can do constantly, and they're kind of the first line of defense. Scott, I did want to go back to something that you brought up. So the ports of influence. I think we had a prospect come to us recently who had actually been attacked, and were they attacked through a port issue?
Yeah, they got attacked through a 3389 that they had open for remote desktop interface, and it was a viable solution and service for their end users, for their users to be able to get into the network. The unfortunate piece is that it was open to the outside to anybody, and it started to be investigated by one of those scripts. Once that script got a hold of it, it started to brute force its way in. And so what does that mean? It means it starts to try to brute force passwords into accounts to see if it can find a weakness in that password control. A lot of times there is a printer that's forward facing on that RDP channel, something that has a built-in password like admin, root admin, and that's where they get their foothold. Once they get in there, they start to process themselves through it, elevate their privilege so they can do more and more damage. Like I said, it does a call out to the threat actor that promoted the script, and it says, hey, I'm in, let's see what we can do. And it starts the process.
Interesting. Yeah. So it's, unfortunately a real life business that has experienced a way that we're talking about right now. So let's move on to once the hackers get in, kind of how they move through your organization.
So now we're talking east-west traffic, right? We were talking about north and south coming from the outside in, but now we're talking east-west. We're talking across the enterprise. So what are some of the ways that they can do that? Number one, your IoT devices, your Internet of Things. These devices are designed by the manufacturer to be accessible to the network, not to be secure. They do not have a lot of security influence to them whatsoever. They're usually designed to be on the shelf first so that they're purchased first. And they are designed to be accessible into the network, actually so accessible that they're there to be accessible to anything within a network. And that's unfortunate because that allows somebody that can compromise that device to have full access to throughout the network. And those devices are normally built with something very minimal into their management platform, aka their backdoor or their management access point, the login password associated to that device. Let me give you an example. A couple of years ago, there was a hacker that took over some 30, 40,000 IoT devices. And when he took those over, he used simple passwords like root, admin, password. And those devices fell victim to that attack. And he was able to take over those devices. So what did he do with those devices? He told every single device to do a DNS query, a domain name search, and just do thousands of DNS queries that you can a second, as many as you can process, execute DNS queries from thousands of devices. What happened? The DNS provider for the East Coast crashed. It couldn't handle all the DNS requests coming from so many devices at one time, and it shut down web access for the East Coast for almost an hour because it's just something that he wanted to prove that you can do. That's all he was doing. He wasn't trying to cause a problem. He was trying to show everybody, I can do this because you're using devices in your network that have simple passwords that are easily compromisable, and I can do things from those devices that can cause the business to go down some level of DoD. In this particular case, it was a DNS attack that got DoD. And so that was a major influence to the US simply because he wanted to show that he could do it. Poor patching of your internal assets. Braxton made a great point about patching your external or your perimeter devices, but you have to patch your internal devices. If a hacker gets into your network, it's going to look for the weakest link. It's going to look for where it can go quickly, efficiently, do the most damage. And not having your devices patched so that they're up to the latest firmware levels, the latest operating system levels, the latest applications levels, is you're allowing that hacker, once they get in, to spread quickly and efficiently throughout your organization. So maintaining good patching is a very important aspect of protection, but knowing that there is a weakness there and not scanning for that weakness within your assets, not knowing that your assets aren't up to date in patching levels are a problem with your protection in your environment. And that's what allows the hackers to actually move rapidly throughout your environment. Privilege of escalation is what the hackers will do when they get into the environment because they want to have the most power that they can do. They'll take a simple account, they'll transition it over to something that has more administrative power within the environment. Once they get more of a foothold, they gain more power, they do more damage into the environment. And so that's a major problem of having something where you do not have power, escalated power accounts restricted. You do not want to have a bunch of open admin accounts. You don't want to have too many domain admins. You don't have too many people with the keys to the kingdom. You want to keep those at a minimum because you don't want those to get compromised. And one of the problems with an east-west lateral is that those accounts are sometimes easily discovered, they're easily compromised, and then once they're taken over, then they have the keys to the kingdom, they have the full power of damage to your network. You certainly do not want to have a domain account person, a domain admin in your network that has email associated to that domain account, right? Going back to the north and west traffic, if that from the outside gets compromised, now they got a domain admin inside your network, and now the east-west becomes very easy.
That's exactly right, Scott. And moving on to that, once a hacker is inside your environment, you can have other internal controls that are in place to help alleviate and to help catch malicious attempts. And one of those is going to be endpoint control, your internal control for that. We talk about antivirus. Antivirus is great. We like to see antivirus, but it needs to be more than that now. We talk about advanced endpoint control now, advanced endpoint protection, things that are like, for example, it's going to be able to do not just antivirus scanning, it's going to do more than just signature-based detection, which is already determining malware that's on endpoints based off of what's already been published and what's been known. It needs to be doing something more, such as behavioral analysis. So if you have zero-day vulnerabilities or brand new malware that gets developed and created that's happening all the time, it needs to see what that malicious attempt or process is trying to do and trying to associate that with other known malicious attempts and seeing if that's similar. So if it's trying to change something or delete something or create something, it's doing a review of that and hopefully protecting you on that end. It's going to be able to do more like web filtering, protecting your end users from going to websites that they really shouldn't be going to and creating risk where they could potentially get tricked into something, and now you have data exfiltration that way. It's going to have data loss prevention policies so that you can't send out sensitive information or files through only approved vectors. You also need to have more in-depth identity controls. We talk about single level identity controls. You only have something like a password policy in place. If you have a strong password policy in place, that's great, but you need to have more than that. You need to have multiple ways for a user to authenticate and authorize that, yes, I am who I say I am. Yes, I should have access to this data. And that way, if that account is ever compromised or it's leveraged for some other way, like when Scott was talking about privilege escalation, that attacker doesn't have free reign over the permissions of that account and that data. Another way that we can slow attackers down and hopefully even stop them is moving away from a flat network. So once an attacker has penetrated your firewall and your perimeter, and now if you have a flat network, they now have access and visibility over everything in the environment. That's all of your workstations, all of your network devices, all of your servers, everything that is important and key and holds your data and keeps the business up and running. If you have a flat network, you are running the risk that they can immediately see what they need to pick out and take over or put down or shut down. So you need to have it sort of segmented in a way where it's kind of like a labyrinth and makes it harder for that attacker to move throughout the environment.
And that's a great point with flat networks. We see that a lot in business. Actually, we've dealt with some clients in the past that because they had a flat network, something came in through the HR department, but actually was able to shut down programs on the plant floor. And there should not be a path to that. There should be a level of separation that prevents that from spreading throughout the enterprise. Somebody that comes into HR should not be able to get to payroll or accounting, right? There should be a separation there. A lot of businesses have VLANs, which is a virtual LAN that creates the ability to separate, but a lot of them are open across those VLANs. Everything is still channelable between the two. There's no separation or control between the two, and that's one of the big problems with how attacks can spread throughout the networks, is because there's no walls up. There's nothing that's dividing those systems from being influenced by another location within the network.
Exactly right.
Absolutely. All right. So now that we've kind of talked about, how hackers can get in, how they can move around once they're in your environment, let's talk about some of the ways that we can prevent and try and stop them.
So least privilege. This is a cornerstone concept in cybersecurity. It's the principle of least privilege. We've already touched on it a little bit. It's the idea that end users should only have permissions and access to data that they really only have a need for, and that's it. For example, you don't want your accountants to have access to human resource information. You don't want your HR director to have information that maybe the C-levels would have, and things of that nature. You don't want tellers to have access to loan officer information. You don't need that intermingling of permissions and access to data, and that prevents that helps to kind of mitigate those accounts being compromised and getting access to information that they shouldn't already. So if you stick with that, you can kind of enforce that through different ways. The most common ways you see role-based access controls, which is just kind of sticking permissions and or access to data kind of based off of job role. That's one of the more popular ones that you see, and one of the more easier ones to implement. There are other ways to do that, but if you need to be using the principle of least privilege when you onboard users, when you get new employees, and even when you terminate, making sure that you have those procedures in place and policies that help drive that within your organization is going to be a big step up in protecting your environment. And we talked about segmenting networks already, that flat network, moving away from that, having it so that your production environment can't speak with your test environment, because your test environment is always volatile. You don't know what's going on in your test environment. That's why it's a test environment. So making sure that that can't talk, and making sure that only certain sections of workstations that have a specific job role can only talk to certain sections of servers that have that specific function, having it VLANed off, having things routed off so that they can't just jump from one node to the other. Another section of that is not specifically outlined here is the concept of air gapping. A key piece in cybersecurity and your cybersecurity program for your organization, your company, is going to be your recoverable model. We talked about it already with Colonial Pipeline. They had to recover from ransomware. If you're using air gapping, you are making it so that if a hacker ever gets into your environment, and let's say they want to encrypt your information, you don't want your backups to be constantly talking with your environment. Because what's going to happen if they encrypt your environment? Well, your backups are now gone, and now you have no recoverable model. So having that air gapping, making it so that your backups are physically removed in most cases, but also logically removed from your environment, is a good way to make sure that you always have something to rely on, so that if you ever need to, you can recover.
Yeah, and that's a great point with the backups, because a lot of the ransomwares, as they're deployed now, the first thing that it does is it goes out and destroys your backups. So now you have to pay. Now you have to pay me because I've just destroyed your recoverable solution. Air gapping is so important right now. And when you think of air gapping, think of it as actually unplugging the backup from the network. So now the hacker has no methodology or path to your networks. Now, do you need to actually unplug it? No, there's technical controls that you can utilize, restricting the access of the backup process so that it's not normal. It's not a normal channel effect. That's an effective version of air gapping. But unplugging it certainly is something that is extremely a way of doing an effective air gap control. Now, another method that we talked about with single passwords being an effective point, adding a layer to that, utilizing a multi-factor authentication principle is effective. Going to Colonial, if they would have had an MFA associated to their VPN accounts, they don't get attacked the way that they did. That doesn't happen, because they wouldn't have that jump into the network that would have required another point of authentication that they did not own, they did not have, and that would have stopped that. And MFA is very effective in that. And you can use MFA in several different methods. You can get something sent to your phone through either using the Microsoft authentication app or others that you can use as an MFA qualifier. I recommend using those apps and not just straight up SMS texting, because SMS texting can be compromised. So if you're using that as an MFA, you are opening a channel for somebody doing a man-in-the-middle style of attack and reading or intercepting that text and being able to read it or provide that information to as the authentication principle. So utilize a MFA, especially anything that's outbound, anything that's going to the internet. If you've transitioned your email from on-premise out to Office 365, put an MFA on it so that a hacker, if it's compromised, now no longer has a simple one-legged approach to accessing that email. They would have to have that second leg, and that's would be effective. And then having the ability to contain infection. A lot of businesses simply don't have the ability to they may have the ability to recognize that they're under attack. Most of the time, it's simply in the element of being reactive. Attacks already happened, and now they're figuring out that something's happened in their enterprise, and they're trying to figure out where it came in from and what it got spread to. But having something in your network that can actually recognize the threat and eliminate it upon recognition is an enormous improvement to being preventive. There are solutions out there that can actually recognize the threat on an endpoint, and this would be called endpoint detection response, which is EDR in its translation. EDR is the ability to see something bad happening on my workstation, and it automatically take my workstation offline. It takes it away from my network. So now something that's happening on that workstation, although it may be encrypting or contaminating that workstation, it cannot take that and spread it into my network because it saw that flag of infection and said, I'm taking it off my network automatically. And that's effective because if it happens at between the hours of 8 and 5, maybe IT can be Johnny on the spot and do something about it. But what if it's after 8 to 5? What if it's 3 o'clock in the morning? You want something that can sit there and say, hey, this is bad. I'm going to stop it now and reduce that footprint in your network of attack. And that is just a great protection piece that a lot of businesses don't take advantage of, but it's out there. It's available for your network.
That's often a roadblock that we hear a lot, Scott, is, great, we have this solution that, looks at events that's happening inside the network and even externally, but now we have to pay someone to manage that and to respond and to react. And maybe we can do that for someone working 8 to 5, but what's going to happen in the middle of the night? There are solutions out there that will do this for you automatically, that will give you the time to get to it.
Interesting. Yeah, all great points, all great things to think about. All right, why don't you guys explain to me why I've got a picture of our president up here now?
So cybersecurity, it's no longer something that IT's concerned about. It's not even something that the CEO or the COO or the CIO for an organization is concerned about. They are, but that's not where it stops. It starts at the President of the United States. The President of the United States, since the pipeline attack, because it was so severe to U.S. channels, that he signed an executive order to improve the nation's cybersecurity. This is a top-down approach from the very highest seat in the House, right? This is the President of the United States saying, we got to do better. We got to do better, and we're going to force businesses to do better. And obviously, they're forcing government entities to do better. They're putting compliance measurements on them. The CMMC level of compliance associated to cybersecurity protection is being levied against anybody that has a government contract. Those types of things are already starting to lay, but he's saying, hey, even if you are a private sector, you must adapt to a continuously changing threat environment and ensure its products and it's built that are built and operate securely, and they need to partner with the government in doing so. And so this type of ordinance, this type of mandate is coming from the president, and it's going to start being levied against everyone to have better security controls, stronger security awareness, more prevention controls put into place so that your business isn't under compromise and you aren't in a position where you'd have to pay a ransomware type of solution. So top down, president, he's making the order.
Yeah, you need to continue to keep your ear to the ground, because we have to already, Scott. But as a leader for your business and your company, you need to keep an ear to the ground, because there could be some changes coming up on guidelines that don't impact you today, but they could later.
Absolutely.
That is a great point. I think that's something. It's coming to industries that maybe were not as regulated previously. Banks, obviously, financial sector has been regulated for a while, but some of these newer ones are definitely things to keep an eye out for.
Well, the government, like I said, they already have the CMMCs level 1 through level 5. They're already starting to push out to any government contracting entities. They're not going to reinvent the wheel. They're going to sit there and say, hey, this works well for what we're doing, and it's going to start channeling to all manufacturing, other entities, other verticals are also going to have to start adapting. They're not going to reinvent the wheel. They're just going to make you start using it.
Absolutely. All right, well, we've got one final poll here, which is, as we've kind of discussed all of this security and your technology in general, I just want to know, how can NetGain possibly help you meet your technology goals? So you just want to go ahead and answer that. And while we've got that open, I'll just get some final thoughts here. So Braxton, what are your final wrap-ups?
Yeah, so I mentioned it in that last slide, but Scott and I, we have an obligation and a responsibility to stay up to date and stay ahead of the curve on cybersecurity happenings, what hackers are going to want to do, what's becoming more and more popular, what's becoming successful, and as a result, we have to stay up to date on security controls for prevention of that, and helping with guidelines and how to help other organizations and companies get to that point to stay safe and to stay protected. I want to just ask a question of the audience, something to kind of just think about, of your own accord, as the leaders of technology and cybersecurity for your organization. If you were breached today and a hacker got into your environment and they encrypted your data, you were hit with ransomware, are you confident that it wouldn't drown your organization? And if you don't know the answer to that, I think it's time to start having a conversation with a cybersecurity professional and making sure that you're making the right decisions to protect your data and your customers' data, and you can continue to be successful in your vertical.
I think that's an excellent point, Braxton. I think something every organization should be thinking about. So awesome. Scott?
Yeah, and to that point, if you're an owner of a business, don't put the responsibility of security on your IT team. They're not security professionals. They probably aren't certified to be able to do that. It's very unfortunate when I come into an organization and I'm trying to structure them and I find out the IT administrator is also the security guy for the organization, and he just doesn't have any idea of how to properly put that organization in a nice posture to where the organization's safe. Make sure that you utilize security professionals, as Braxton said, to have that understanding, and don't put that responsibility on somebody that's just not trained to do that.
Definitely. Another excellent point to think about. All right, so that kind of wraps up our content, but we've got our Q&A here. So let me take a look at our questions, and feel free, you can still submit any questions you have as we're kind of wrapping up here. So just, everyone's got a couple more minutes to kind of toss them in there. But let me go ahead and see. All right, so I'll throw this one to Scott. So somebody's asking, they do social awareness testing 2 times per year, and they're wondering if that's sufficient.
2 times a year. Well, first of all, it's better than not doing it. That's an improvement. Is it enough? Probably not. Social attacks change constantly. They're constantly introducing new types of threats through phishing attacks. They're constantly adding phishing attacks into social awareness attacks, even smishing attacks, which is SMS attacks. And now they're starting to layer those attacks. They're setting up phishing campaigns with voice, calling up a user and saying, hey, you're going to be receiving an email, blah, blah, blah. And when the user gets the email, now all of a sudden they've developed a level of trust about that email. I was expecting that. Somebody told me to expect it, and here it is, so it must be legit. And that's unfortunate because they're able to elevate their ability to get phishing compromise. And so it's certainly important to do it more often. I recommend doing something that's more continuous and not in the effort of sending the same fish to every user either. You want to have it random, because what you want to do is you want to avoid collusion. You don't want, I'm going to use a bank as an example, a teller to receive a fish, them recognize it, and then tell the other 3 people that are next to them that this is a fish, don't fall victim for it. and now you've introduced a level of collusion that now prevents you from being more secure. You didn't gain the education by them actually making that discovery and that recognition of threat on their own. So I recommend that it's done randomly. I recommend that it's done continuously, and you should execute trainings continuously, not just phish, but associate trainings. Send out trainings about what ransomware is, what working from home should be like, how to keep your phone safe. There's so many cybersecurity training efforts out there that you should utilize, and deliver it as often as you can to your staff. You don't want to overburden them by testing them daily, but certainly keep them on a rotational basis, maybe on a monthly rotation of tests and a monthly rotation of cyber influence or cyber education.
Good. Those are some great points. We've got another one here, Braxton. I'll throw it to you. How does Apple versus PC compare in this area? I'm thinking they're talking about security in general. So if maybe you just want to speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, it's actually well, they used to advertise it a lot. You would hear that PCs get viruses and Macs don't. That's not true. Macs absolutely get viruses. I think Apple has moved away a little bit from the enterprise game, so they don't have much in the way in terms of servers and things of that nature for solutions. So we're talking primarily Microsoft when we're talking organizations, but. Yeah, don't believe the hype. Don't trust in the hype. Anything can get viruses. Anything can get attacked. Anything can get hacked. Nothing's foolproof in the cybersecurity world. So you need to always make sure that you're using these security controls, not just the ones that we talked about today. There are hundreds that Scott and I could have talked about all day today. But the big ones that we talked about, at least, you should be looking at and making sure that you're utilizing for your company and your business.
Definitely. Thanks, Braxton. Okay, so we've got another one. I think I'm going to let each of you answer this. I'll let Scott start out just because I think it's a good point. So somebody's asking, what's your opinion on the growing cyber attacks? As the advancements in securities are growing, the attacks are growing at the same pace as well. So yeah, Scott, I'll let you start off.
Well, that statement's actually very true. The same AI that we're trying to use as prevention is levied against us in attacks. As the attackers continually get better, we need to get better, and we need to have the understanding of how to be preventive, how to recognize, and it's a very disconcerting problem because we keep paying them to get better. We keep giving the ransomware payments over to them, and they keep elevating their ability to do more and more damage and improve their methodologies of attack. And their attack isn't now so much that it's a force into the network. It's almost like a silence into the network. It's a sneaky way that they get in, and then they sit there for a long period of time before they ever execute the payload. They're doing more reconnaissance work once they get in there to figure out where all they can go, what levels of privilege they can achieve before they ever pull the trigger. So it's very smart, very sneaky, and unfortunately, we have to be on top of our game to get better about that. We have to have stronger recognition, more trained security professionals to be able to educate, elevate the understandings of protections, provide those controls, deliver those controls, and make businesses safer. It's a balance, but it's unfortunately a balance on the poor side. We're on the bottom side of that, unfortunately, right now.
It's constant education. It never stops and it never will. You can equate it to practicing medicine. Doctors don't just do their 8, 12 years and that's it. They know everything they need to know. No, they're constantly looking up studies and reading about things. So we're doing the exact same, just from a technology point of view. So that's always going to have to happen. We'll be doing it, and you should be doing it as well. There's really never going to be a point where we can safely say, yeah, nothing's going to get through, because they're working just as hard as we are. So
yeah. Unplug your network, take it off the internet. That's your safe pull. If you want one, that's it.
Take out the old sledgehammer.
Yep.
All right. Well, that was a great question. Thanks, guys. And Scott, we've got another one. What separates NetGain from competitors?
What separates us? I think a lot of thing that separates NetGain from some of our competition is our dedication. We have a lot of tenure here. We have a lot of trained professionals that are experts in what we do, and we're not experts for everything. We have experts that can do everything across our group. We've got Cisco professionals, we got Microsoft professionals, we got security professionals, and in combination, it makes us a very strong MSP foundation. And I think that's probably one of our strongest aspects is we've got great professionals in the organization, and they're very dedicated to what they do.
Yeah, I think that's showcased here by both of you. You both love security, want to help our clients, you know, are really passionate about constantly learning and helping them as well. So awesome. I think we've got one more here, which I'll throw to Braxton. So from your experience, what's one control that prospective clients are missing that could heavily influence their risk of a breach?
Wow, great question.
Yeah, so there are several that I could say, but the biggest one that stands out to me would be not having a well-oiled vulnerability management program. So not having, we talked about poor patching externally and internally. Vulnerability scanning and vulnerability management is going to help your organization and your team find the biggest weaknesses for your assets in your environment. So not having policies in place that kind of outline, you know, the cadence on when you do vulnerability scanning, what do the remediations for that look like, and what's within scope of that vulnerability scanning is going to lead to issues where, number one, you're not aware of how weak internally and externally you are, which is going to cause a domino effect of hackers are going to see you out on the edge. They're going to try to exploit things that you've not patched. So not having any of that in place is there's going to constantly be an infection of weakness for your assets that's not going to get the medicine that it needs. So it's going to be like fighting a forest fire with a spray bottle. You're not going to get much done. So it's going to cause a lot of problems for you.
Ask me, Maddie, ask me.
All right, Scott, same question.
Not understanding your risk. If you don't have a risk assessment done and haven't had one done for a long period of time, you don't know what's wrong in your environment. You're not going to know where your infection is going to come from. You have to have a risk assessment done that can review what your administrative controls are, what policies and procedures that you're using in order to be safeguarded and protected, what technical controls you're using, how good is your firewall, how good is your web filter, how good is your AV solution, and what your physical controls are, because physical access is still something that happens, and you need to understand what those physical controls are. Are they auditable? Can you tell me who's been in and out that door? Those are the types of things that you need to understand to identify what your risk is. If you don't know what your risk is, you don't know what you need to do to be preventive.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think and NetGain has some resources on risk assessments for sure. You can visit our website to read more about those, and obviously reach out to us as well. And I don't think I mentioned this before, but obviously you can feel free to contact us using the information on the screen. Scott and Braxton, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. I think that's all the questions we have. So we'll go ahead and wrap it up here, but really appreciate your time today. Thanks everyone in the audience for joining. And yeah, feel free to reach out. Have a great rest of your day.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.